Good afternoon. So how is everybody? Good afternoon? Hello? Okay, you're there, good. All right, so my talk was advertised as saying that I would talk about how reading affects brain development. Mechanisms of phonological awareness and blah, blah, blah. And then effects of electronic media on reading and social media, etc. And I will talk about those things, but you know that every professor says they're going to talk about some things and then always talks about something else, right? So, I am going to ask you to start using your thing right away, and I want just 1 or 2 words for each of my questions. I don't have the questions up the way that Matve had them, but I want you to just put 1 or 2 words for each question I have for you, because this is what I'm going to be talking about. And I'm very curious in knowing what your answers are. So, if we could get your answers put up right away for a moment. I'm going to talk actually about what children need to know in order to read, and I'm going to ask you. Which skills are most important, or what should we spend most time on? How does reading change children's worlds? Does it matter what we read? Does it matter what language? And what about ebooks? Will they destroy us? And so I will be talking about the brain, and I will be talking about the mind. So very quickly, if you can even answer just a couple of those questions, I'm very curious about your answers. So can you put those up? Okay, let's forget about technology for a moment. And what do children need to know in order to read? An extrovert, shout out a word.
Eyes.
They need to know what?
Eyes.
Eyes. They need to have eyes, but they don't need to know about eyes, do they? I think they need to have eyes, unless they have to have some sensory way of taking in information. Okay, what else? Alphabet. Okay, what else?
Language.
Language? Words? The language? What else? Okay, remember your answers. Which skills? Signs. How about symbols? Which skills are most important for reading? If you're going to spend time teaching a child or trying to help somebody read, what's most important?
Big experience with language.
Experience with language, okay. Anything else? Oh, it's important that it's interesting. Good content, okay. How does reading change children's worlds?
A new way of receiving information.
Okay. Is it the same kind of information that you get from reading as you might get from day-to-day interactions? No? No? Why?
It's different because it's like other world. It's not. It's usually it's like other world.
Okay. Does it matter what language you learn to read in?
Yes.
Why?
Because the order of the words in different languages is different. Sometimes it goes subject verb object. Sometimes it's the other way around. So perception.
Mainly the perception of the words, because, for example, if you learn Chinese or Japanese, it's completely different if you learn Russian, for example.
Okay. What about ebooks? Are they going to destroy us? And electronic media, social media in general, are they going to destroy reading? If we spend all our time just like punching in on our phones, are we going to forget how to write? Are we going to forget how to read long passages and just read Twitter, like the American president? That's all he can read and write. Oh, I didn't say that. Mm-hmm.
But also, for example, Tolstoy.
Okay, yeah, Tolstoy is very long. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a really interesting fact. You see my hand? See it? It's a hand. I want you to look at your hand, especially your right hand if you are right-handed and your left hand if you are left-handed. Okay? Now I want you to, if you have a pen, pick up a pen. And look at your hand when you're picking up the pen. Look over here when you're picking up the pen. So pick up the pen, hold it. So just do this as if you're going to write. Now look here. Okay, you see it? You have a muscle there. Believe it or not. If you don't have a muscle there, you are very young. Because, now pick up your phone. What do you notice about that muscle? This muscle. Pick up your pen, pick up your phone, compare. It's much, much smaller. In fact, children in elementary school right now in the US, I can't speak for Russia, but many children in elementary school, this muscle is very, very weak. And it's not very functional because they've grown up with devices. And having a flat hand like this is a problem if you want to write. So I remember when this muscle got very, very good was when I lived in China for a year. And it was like the first few weeks, I always had cramps here because I was using chopsticks all the time. So this muscle is a muscle that changes depending on the device that we use. So if this can change so dramatically in young children born now or 5 to 10 years ago versus you, what do you think is going to be happening in our brains? So I want you to think about the question, but I want to start by really looking at, so this is what I'm really going to talk about. Okay, so we're going to get rid of the word cloud and go back to, all right, so these are things that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to talk about them one at a time. So the first thing I'm going to really talk about is what do children need to know in order to read. And I would argue it's much more than an alphabet, and it's much more than having a perceptual system that can take in information. Deal with these later. So ABCs in English, the Cyrillic version of that in Russian. What about for Chinese? Well, they need to know ABCs. For pinyin, there's a romanized system, and then they also need to know a lot about strokes. They need to have the spoken language, vocabulary in that language. They need to know which sounds are sounds in the language. For instance, zdra is not a sound in English. It's also not a sound in Mandarin. But the distinction between ma, 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 ma is not important in Russian. Okay? But if you are in China and you say da ma, that means an old lady, babushka. Okay? If you say da ma, in China, probably in Russia, you are asking for something illegal. It is now legal in the state of Michigan and and it is legal in Canada. If you are asking for dama, somebody is going to bring you a very big horse. And finally, if you say dama, that means you are cursing somebody a lot. So that distinction between tones, ma, 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 is very, very important in Chinese. Right? So if you are trying to get a big horse and somebody brings you something illegal, you could get into big trouble. You certainly don't want to call babushka a horse or curse at her. Okay? So different languages have different sounds, and we need to know what's important because those are always coded into the language itself. We need to know how words are formed and changed. And we need to know how sentences and stories are changed. Now, most of what you came here to listen to is more down here, but the problem is in development, it often goes this way. So children first start hearing the general patterns of a language, and then they get into the sounds, and then they get into the words, and then finally they learn to read. Okay, so I want you to keep this in mind, and we're going to move on to the next part. So which skills are most important? And I'm going to take a break after this section, I think. Okay, so what predicts children's reading skills? There are two general categories. One is category of the parent and the other, and the environment, and the other is category of the child. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but I want you to think about what really matters in reading. So this is a very famous study in the United States. It's been talked about since it first was published in 2003. And this study followed 52 families from when the children were 1 year of age up until 9, 10, 11 years of age. And it started out at 1 to 3 years of age, recording the amount of speech that the parents used as well as the children used. And what they found was very, very surprising. Parents who had bachelor's degrees or master's degrees and worked in professional occupations spoke much, much more to their children than parents with only high school degrees, and even more so than parents who had less than high school degrees. Now, that's surprising when you think about it, because really it's just about talking to their children. But there are huge differences, and in fact, if you project out to age 4, which is about the time that children enter preschool, what you find is that there are 30 million fewer words addressed to children from lower income and lower education families than children from higher income and higher education families. So one of the most important factors in reading development is the education and background of the parents. But how can we reduce this? Because if we want to have a civilized and cultured and educated society, we can't separate it into children of parents who are educated, and I mean we can, and basically throughout history societies have continued to do this. But what are some ways that can help balance things? I'm going to talk about a couple, but here's a question for you. This is multiple choice. Can we put it on the word cloud again? Okay, ready? Actually, don't put it up yet. I want to see. Yeah, keep it there. No, don't put it up yet. I want to wait. Come on, there's only 9 people that have answered. We need a little bit more. 10. Okay, so go ahead, and the most popular answer is 4 and 5. Oh, we got some more 7s and 6, and I think that's good. Okay, so let's go back to my answers, and this is the answer of many different researchers. Okay, so 5 is the most popular. Well, here we go. Nobody said 3. Nobody. You think it's a silly answer? I do too, but surprisingly, this is a study across 27 nations. It's been found again and again in studies in the US. And it's been found even in poorer areas where people don't have the money for buying books, but they do have a local library. They looked at families who leave the library and they counted the number of books and then looked at what the children's reading skills were. And surprisingly, this is a theoretical model. I'm not going to show you the actual numbers for it, but you think about this social difference in children's reading skills as being related to occupation, income, and education, but completely independently, the number of books has its own effect. So you can have parents with very high education who do not have many books, and surprisingly, it's not the number of children's books. It's the number of books owned by parents that is the most predictive. Why? Why should that matter? Yeah.
It's an opportunity to share the kids to read, because when you have different books, you can choose one. It's an opportunity for kids to read something, because if you have several books, you can choose one which looks more interesting for you and start reading.
So, but
It's about diversity of words and themes in different groups, different words.
But why should it matter that the parents' books
It
are...
sounds like a confounding.
Hmm?
It sounds like confounding.
Sounds like a confounding variable?
It's like an environment in which you are living. It's like a normal to when you see that your parents have a lot of books, you think that it's normal, it's useful, and that you also need it. It's like an environment for me.
Okay. So if your parents have lots of shoes, you buy lots of shoes?
I think maybe yes.
Maybe the parents could read the books and then sell books to their kids, and if they don't read books, they just don't have a lot of stories to tell to their kids.
Okay. So actually, I think all of those are good answers. The confounding one, I wouldn't say is necessarily a confound as much as it reflects a lot of things. And I like to think of it, and when we talk as developmental psychologists, we think about developmental cascades. I study early development because I understand the importance of early development on later development. Little differences can lead to huge differences. So one, it could be the value placed on reading. But these are things that have direct correlations. How often parents read to their children is related to the number of books that parents have, as well as the number of books they have for their children. Children's vocabulary is related to how often parents read. Children's emergent reading skills, knowing what direction to hold a book, what direction to flip the pages. And these skills, vocabulary and emergent skills, are also related to later reading levels. So I like to think of it not simply as a confound, but really as something that starts the cascade. So you can think of a mountain, and you can think of a little bit of rain at the top of the mountain. Well, if it's a little bit of rain at the top of the mountain, and a little bit in the middle, and a little bit further down, you get a very big river at the end, right? So that's how we think of developmental cascades. And so it's important, if we know these differences early on, to really think about how to, how to address them. So number 4 was a popular one for this group. And what about universal preschool and education? In the former Soviet Union and in China, where I've spent 31 years going back and forth, so since I was 2 years old, right? No. One of the things that was done was this idea of universal preschool education. And so this is data collected from Beijing, China. in a longitudinal study that I have done with my colleagues, and we studied these children every year from age 1 to age 15. And now these children are about your age. In fact, last fall, I was in Beijing, and one of my colleagues told me, "You won't believe what happened." My student was teaching at this university, and she was teaching about longitudinal methods, and she put something up from her dissertation on this data set, and one of the students put up her hand and said, "I was one of those children." So it's important that we share our research with our participants. What we found in this paper is that the normal relationship between parent education, income, and occupation and children's reading skills at age 9 disappeared if you took into account early vocabulary measured at age 3, 4, and 5, and early phonology, their ability to manipulate the sounds of their language, ma, 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 and hearing those and being able to pronounce them and play with them. These two skills completely removed the effect of education. Now, that doesn't mean that education of parents isn't related to these two skills. It is related. However, if you can do an intervention that improves children's understanding of words, their ability to produce words, and their understanding of the sounds of their language, you can actually make this effect disappear. Okay, so you also liked number 5. And I liked number 5 too, because that's mostly what my research is about. Number 6 is also relevant. So it's not just owning books. It's not like shoes. There are some people who own lots of shoes but don't wear them. Or lots of handbags. I don't know. And also reading to children more. These things together are much more important than just the parent's education. So I want to now get you thinking about the direction of what reading does to children's minds. So I'm going to start with reading from parents as opposed to children's reading, because it's important to really think about what the entire mechanism is about. So this is a paper, again, not one of mine, but a wonderful paper with lots of, it's a meta-analysis. So what they did was compared reading periods versus non-reading periods, and what they found is that there were much higher word counts during reading periods when parents were reading to children than not. There was much more engagement and interaction, and importantly, this was even true for parents with less education. So if you can get those parents reading more, and it's not that they need to be reading they don't need to read Tolstoy. They can be reading, I learned about a little goose. What is it? Goosey, yeah, you know that one, right? Okay, my Russian teacher made me learn it. Oh, and I was so humiliated, but next time I should perform it for you. Okay, so even parents with low education can read these books to their children. And so this really matters. There are also really strong gender effects, and I think that in a lot of families, what you find is that especially for boys who like to move around, it's hard to find time to have them sitting down and reading. But it's actually extremely important, and the effect is stronger for boys even than for girls. Okay? All right, so do we need to take a break at this point? Because I'm about to move on to the next topic.